No one would ever imagine that behind that shy smile lived a weight that words could not describe. Clara was only 15 years old. Sweet, polite, studious. The typical girl that the neighbors pointed out with pride. But no one knew. No one even suspected. It was in silence that Clara carried a secret that tightened her chest and made even her eyes hurt. A secret that began on any given afternoon, inside her own home, with someone she trusted, someone from the family, an older cousin. And there, in that moment, something inside her broke. Before I continue this story, take a deep breath, because what you are about to hear is real. And if this truth touches you in any way, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like Clara's need to be heard, not out of drama, but out of urgency, because there are many Claras in silence right now. Back to that afternoon. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She froze. Like so many victims, her body reacted as best it could, but the pain that remained stuck like a knife, even when everything around her seemed normal. Clara didn't tell anyone, out of fear, out of shame, because she didn't even know what she was feeling. And that's something that happens more than you might think. The fear of not being believed. The fear of being blamed. The fear of destroying the family. Days turned into weeks. And every time the phone rang, or she heard footsteps approaching, Clara felt her stomach turn. She slept badly. She ate little. And she smiled, just to avoid raising suspicions. Because it was easier to smile than to explain. She went to school like any other girl. But inside her, there was a war. Her notebook full of letters hid small tear marks. And no one saw it. No one saw it because she was good at hiding it. But there was something in Clara that resisted. A small thread of strength that, even weakened, was still there. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just the desire for it all to pass soon. And it did. At least in her body. Because the pain remained in the soul. It was in a writing class that everything began to change. The topic was, what would you change in the world? Clara picked up the pen. She looked at the blank paper. And for the first time, she let her voice escape, even if hidden in metaphors. She wrote. And she wrote as if she were bleeding in silence. The teacher read the text out loud. She didn't know it, but she was reading Clara's soul. And at that moment, other eyes opened. Some classmates were silent. Others were moved. Clara, curled up in her chair, was shaking. But no one knew that that text was the beginning of something bigger. Something she didn't yet understand. A seed of courage had been planted. And even without realizing it, Clara was beginning to take the first step towards breaking the silence. That night, at home, she reread the text 10 times. And she cried. Cried like she hadn't in months. But it was a different kind of crying. The kind of crying that comes when you finally start to free your voice. Days later, she decided to keep the notebook in a special place. Not because she wanted to forget, but because she knew that text would be important. And it was. It was the beginning of everything. Clara still didn't have the strength to speak out loud. But she had written. And writing was what saved her life. Writing was her first bridge to the truth. This was the beginning of Clara's story. A story that starts with pain, but that will transform lives. Because her silence will become a voice. Clara spent days staring at that notebook as if it were some kind of mirror. It didn't reflect her face, but rather her pain, her courage, her attempt to scream without being heard. It was just paper and ink, but it carried the weight of a world no one could imagine. She started to write more. Sometimes in the middle of the night, when everyone was asleep and the silence felt safer. Other times, hidden in the bathroom, with the shower running to drown out the sound of her crying. What once was fear of remembering had now turned into a need not to forget. because forgetting would be like pretending it never happened. And Clara knew that if she pretended for too long, she'd end up losing herself. So she wrote. She wrote like someone trying to stitch an open wound with words. It was pages and more pages filled with memories, feelings, and questions. Why me? What did I do wrong? Would anyone believe me? Questions without answers, but ones that could no longer remain silent.
She still didn't have the courage to tell anyone. But through writing, she felt less alone. It was as if, with every sentence, she was reaffirming her existence. As if she were saying, "I'm here, even if you don't see me." Clara's gaze began to change. It was no longer just the look of someone carrying pain. It was also the look of someone trying to understand. She watched the people around her more closely, trying to figure out if anyone else felt what she felt. Trying to find, without even knowing it, other silences like her own. At school, the writing teacher started to notice. Clara always turned in her assignments on time, but there was something different about the last few. They were deep, intense, full of soul. And that didn't go unnoticed. One afternoon, while returning a writing assignment, the teacher came closer and said quietly, "You have a beautiful voice when you write, Clara. Never stop writing." She just smiled. But inside, something lit up. That small sentence was like a key. A key that opened a crack in the dark room where Clara was hiding inside herself. She wasn't ready to speak. But maybe she was ready to be read. The following week, she gathered her courage and handed in one of her most intense texts to the teacher. It didn't name names. It didn't describe the event in detail. But anyone who read it carefully would understand that there was something there crying out for help. The teacher read it. Carefully. In silence. And when she finished, she looked at Clara with a kind of respect that can't be expressed in words. She didn't ask questions. She didn't push. She simply said, "If you ever want to talk, I'm here." Clara didn't answer. She just lowered her eyes and nodded slightly. It was little. But it was a lot. It was the first time someone had offered a safe space. A listening ear. A presence. And that stayed with her. That night, Clara wrote about that look. About how, for the first time, someone seemed to see past the disguise. And when she finished, she realized she was starting to trust again. Slowly, like someone learning to walk after being down for a long time. The notebook stopped being just a hiding place. It became a path. A refuge pointing toward a possible way out. Clara still didn't know how, or when. But she felt, deep in her soul, that all of this would one day make sense. Because maybe, one day, her story could help someone. And just the possibility of that was reason enough to keep writing. The days that followed were different. Not because the pain had gone, but because Clara was starting to take small steps out of the darkness. Something inside her was changing, even if still afraid. The teacher's presence, even in silence, was like a light left on at the end of a hallway that had been too long. Clara kept writing. Each text was a piece of what she felt, an attempt to translate what seemed impossible to explain. She didn't use names, didn't use dates, but everything in it was real. It was her life, her still open wound, but now less alone. One afternoon, when she got home, she found her cousin in the living room. The same cousin. The same look that used to cause panic now triggered a different kind of reaction. Clara didn't freeze. She trembled inside, yes. But she held his gaze for seconds that felt like hours. And in that moment, she realized, she was no longer the same. Still fragile, but not broken. Still afraid, but something inside her was growing. A kind of strength born from survival. A kind of courage no one sees, but that changes everything. That night, as she wrote, she didn't cry. For the first time, she wrote with anger. A clean anger, from someone who recognizes injustice. From someone who understands that she wasn't to blame. And that awareness hurt more than anything. But it also set her free. She remembered the times she tried to blame herself. The time she thought that maybe, if she had screamed, maybe if she had fought back. But now she knew, it wasn't her fault. It never was. What happened wasn't her mistake, it was a crime committed against her. Clara decided to reread all her old writings. Every word, every paragraph, was like revisiting a scar. And the more she read, the more she realized there was indeed a story there. A story that needed to be told. Not just by her, but by all the other silenced voices. At school, she started going to the library more often. She read about overcoming, about trauma, about people who found strength where there was only pain. And she saw herself in these stories. In each one of them, she saw a possible reflection. A future that was still distant, but real. The teacher noticed her change. Little by little, Clara stopped being just the silent student at the back of the room. Now, her texts were read with more attention. And not just by the teacher. A classmate praised her. Another was moved. Little by little, without realizing it, Clara was touching hearts. She still couldn't speak. But her writing made noise. It was like a whisper that grew, passed through the paper and reached where it needed to. The girl who had been silenced now made others hear her, even without a voice. At home, it was still difficult. The family's silence was a wall. No one knew, and she still didn't have the strength to break through that limit. But what had once been total solitude now had gaps. And through those gaps, the light entered. One night, she wrote a letter. She didn't deliver it. She kept it in the same box where the notebook was. It was addressed to her mother. Clara wanted to tell her. She wanted to scream everything. But it wasn't time yet. She knew. She needed a little more. One more push. In the letter, she said that she didn't want to destroy anyone, she just wanted to rebuild herself. She said that her love for her family remained, but that silence could no longer protect them at the cost of her own soul. And when she finished writing, she felt something new, relief. She didn't know when she would have the courage to deliver that letter. But just by having written it, she knew she was closer to freedom. And for the first time, when she looked at herself in the mirror, she didn't just see the girl marked by fear. She saw a survivor. Because Clara was beginning to understand that her pain, however deep, didn't define her. She was more. Much more. And one day, the whole world would know. Clara woke up with her heart racing. She had dreamed about the letter. In the dream, she handed it to her mother, but when she opened it and read it, her mother just looked at her, turned her back and left. Clara woke up with the bitter taste of rejection in her mouth, her chest tight as if the dream had been real. But it was just a dream. She repeated this to herself, trying to convince her own fear that not everything that goes through her mind has to happen. Even so, she put the letter back away, at the bottom of the box, like someone who keeps something too precious for the world. The days dragged on between courage and hesitation. There were times when Clara thought she was ready. She would pick up the letter, hold it in her hands, go down a few steps, and then stop. She would come back, in silence, and hide it again. At school, something different happened. The teacher launched a volunteer project, to write an anonymous text that would be read in class, to promote empathy among the students. Clara knew what she wanted to do. But it took her 2 days to decide that yes, she would send one of her texts. She signed it with just the letter C. She chose one of the most intense ones. One that talked about screaming without sound, about carrying an entire world on your shoulders and still smiling so as not to scare others. She handed it in silently. And waited. That Friday, the teacher read the text at the end of class. The room, usually noisy, fell into absolute silence. There were no names, but there was pain. There was truth. And when she finished, Clara felt tears flow, not of sadness, but of relief. No one knew it was hers. But there, even in secret, she had been heard. Her story had touched hearts. Some classmates seemed restless, touched. A girl, as she left the room, cried softly. And Clara understood, she was not alone. After that reading, the teacher began to suggest more activities like that. And, little by little, other texts arrived. Clara read each one as if it were part of her. And in many, she recognized similar traits: guilt, fear, silence. It was then that she felt something different for the first time. Not only the desire to speak, but to help. To tell someone, I felt that too. I also thought it was my fault. But it wasn't. It never was. And that began to mature like a seed. At home, the words wouldn't come out. But her eyes began to scream. Her mother noticed. Is everything okay, daughter? Clara wanted so much to say no. That there was a world trapped inside her begging to come out. But she could only respond with a weak smile. A smile that no longer deceived like it used to. It was that same day that Clara did something small, but immense. She took out her cell phone, opened the conversation with the teacher and wrote, "It's me." The text of the letter C. "Thank you for reading." And sent it. Her heart almost jumped out of her chest. The answer came in a few minutes. You were brave. And you turned silence into something powerful. Whenever you want to talk, I'll be here. Clara cried. She cried like someone who's seen for the first time without having to hide. That night, she didn't write. She just lay down hugging her pillow and let the tears wash over everything. Not out of despair. It was just the beginning of her tears. Her body, after so much time on alert, was beginning to rest. The next morning, she looked at the box where the letter was kept. She didn't take it out. Not yet. But something inside her told her that the time was coming. That soon, very soon, she wouldn't just write. She would speak. And when that happened, she knew, nothing would silence her anymore. Sunday dawned cloudy, as if the sky shared the weight that Clara carried inside. She looked out the window and, for a moment, thought about everything she had survived so far. Not like someone counting pain, but like someone who realizes that she's standing tall, despite everything. She went down to the cafe, sat at the table and observed her mother's gestures. The way she arranged the cutlery, the way she looked at Clara with affection, but also with a certain distance. There was love, but there was also absence. And that hurt more than any badly spoken word. "You've been so quiet these days, daughter," her mother said. Clara bit her lip, holding back the urge to run away, to avoid the subject as she always did. She thought about the letter. She thought about everything she wanted to say. But her mouth was still too small for so much truth. "I'm just tired, Mom." She lied. But it was a lie that begged to be denied. Her mother nodded with a sad smile, perhaps believing, perhaps pretending to believe. They both knew there was something there that had not yet been said. Clara went back to her room and spent hours looking at the box. The letter was there, intact, like a bomb ready to explode. She took it in her hands, read it once more, word for word. And she realized that, even without giving it to her, it was already changing something inside her. On Monday, she met her teacher in the hallway. They stopped for a second. One look was enough. The teacher asked, "Do you want to talk in private?" Clara hesitated, but answered with a slight nod. The answer was not spoken, but it was clear as ever. At break time, they went to an empty classroom. Clara sat down, her hands sweating coldly, her heart racing as if it were racing against something inside her. The teacher waited, silent, as if she understood that pain needs time to subside. Clara tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come out. She took a deep breath, looked at her hands, and then murmured, "That text wasn't just a rant. It was real." The teacher didn't say anything. She just leaned forward a little, her eyes attentive and present. "It was my cousin," Clara continued, in an almost choked whisper. "When I was younger. I couldn't. I didn't understand. And then I thought it was my fault." Tears began to fall. But she didn't hide. For the first time, she let herself cry in front of someone. The teacher took a tissue, without rushing, and offered it to her. "You're not to blame for anything, Clara. Absolutely nothing." The words came like a bomb. Clara was crying, but she was crying for release. It was as if, when she spoke, part of the weight lifted from her body. They talked for almost an hour. Clara didn't tell him everything at once. She couldn't. But what she had said was already too much. It was everything. She had been heard. She had been welcomed. And that was the beginning of something that, for so long, she had thought was impossible, healing. As she left school, Clara looked at the sky. It was still cloudy. But now she saw a space there. A ray of light trying to break through. The pain was still there. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she was alone with herself. Arriving home, she walked up the stairs slowly, with the letter still in her backpack. She looked back at her mother, who was waiting for her with a cup of tea. "Is everything okay?" she asked, once more. Clara sat down on the sofa and, silently, took the letter out of her backpack. She handed it to her. Her mother looked at her confused, then surprised, then scared. "Read it when you're alone. But please, read everything." That was all Clara could say before going up to her room. She closed the door with her heart racing. But there was no going back. And even with her fear, Clara knew, that day, her soul had begun to speak out loud. That night seemed longer than all the others. Clara lay in bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her ears alert to any sound coming from downstairs. She knew that, at some point, her mother would read the letter. And when that happened, silence would no longer be a shelter. She didn't know how much time had passed until she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her heartbeat accelerated. It was as if each beat announced the beginning of a new phase, a new Clara. The doorknob turned slowly. The door opened. It was her mother. Her eyes were red. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. Clara nodded, sitting up in bed, as if her body knew that this moment could not be lived lying down. She had to be present. Whole. Even if she was afraid, even if she was trembling. Her mother sat down next to her and, for a few seconds, just looked at her. "Daughter, why didn't you tell me before?" Her voice was choked, and her eyes were watery. Clara wanted to respond with anger, with pain, with everything that had been bottled up for so long. But she just said, "I was afraid." And the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't the same silence as before. It was a dense silence, full of love, regret, protection. A silence of someone who doesn't know what to say, but is there, body and soul. The mother held Clara's hand. And that, in itself, was already an answer. Was it that day, on that trip? She asked. Clara closed her eyes. She nodded. The mother swallowed hard. Her world, at that moment, was crumbling into 1,000 pieces. But she didn't allow herself to cry out loud. She knew that now it was Clara who needed to be held. "You're not to blame for anything, my love." "Nothing. I should have realized." The words were spoken as if asking for forgiveness with the heart. Clara broke down. She cried like never before. And, for the first time, in her mother's arms. The hug lasted for long minutes. And, even so, it seemed like little. Years of pain compressed into one gesture. But that hug, that caress, was as if someone were saying, "Now you're safe. Now, no one will hurt you anymore." The next morning, Clara woke up with swollen eyes, but with something different inside. She felt strange. Empty and full at the same time. She knew the journey was far from over, but a giant step had been taken. She was no longer alone. Her mother made coffee and, without saying much, simply said, "Let's look for help. Someone who knows how to take care of this with you." Clara didn't answer. She just nodded. Deep down, she felt afraid of what was to come, but also relieved. Finally, what she felt was being acknowledged. At school, she found her teacher and told her she had delivered the letter. The teacher's eyes lit up. "You are brave, Clara. More than you can imagine." And that sentence echoed inside her for the rest of the day. Clara still avoided crossing paths with her cousin. Just remembering it made her body go cold. But now she knew, what he did would be faced. Not as revenge. But as justice. Because silence would no longer be her shield. It would be her weapon. That week, she wrote again. A different text. One that talked about reconstruction. About how it is possible to be born again, even after being buried alive by pain. And when she finished, she signed it with her full name. For the first time, Clara no longer wrote just for herself. She wrote for all the girls who were still silent. For all the Claras hiding behind a smile. And she knew that one day, those words would find someone who needed them. That night, before going to sleep, Clara looked at herself in the mirror. There were still marks. There was still fear. But there was also strength. A strength that was growing. And that, now, no one could stop. The day of the therapy arrived like a silent earthquake in Clara's chest. On the outside, she tried to appear calm. On the inside, it was as if everything was about to fall apart again. But she didn't back down. She got in the car with her mother and drove to the clinic, staring out the window, as if she were trying to escape through the landscape. The therapist was a woman with a calm voice and attentive eyes. She welcomed Clara with a discreet smile, without invading her space, without rushing her pain. You can start by talking about whatever you want. Or you can stay silent. Here, the time is yours. And for the first time, Clara felt that she didn't need to force herself to do anything. For the first few minutes, she just cried. She didn't even know where to start. How could she explain something that should never have happened? How could she put into words a trauma that invaded her childhood and rewrote her entire story without permission? But the therapist didn't interrupt her. She waited. And in the middle of her tears, Clara stammered out her first sentence, "I was 12. After that, the words came little by little, broken, timid, but true. And so, the process of reconstruction began. Outside, Clara's mother waited anxiously. She didn't know exactly what her daughter would reveal, but she felt, deep down, that each detail would be a new wound to be touched. Still, she was there. Willing to listen. To face whatever was necessary. After the session, Clara left with a tired face, but with her shoulders a little less heavy. In the car, she didn't say anything. But she held her mother's hand. It was enough to say, "I'm trying. I'm going." And that, at that moment, was everything. Days later, with the support of her therapist and the school, she made the most difficult decision, to officially tell what had happened. To seek legal help. Clara felt scared, ashamed, angry. But above all, she felt it was time to do something. Not just for herself, but for everyone who couldn't. At the police station, sitting in the cold room, she felt like giving up. The walls seemed to be closing in, the minutes didn't pass. But she took a deep breath. She closed her eyes. And she remembered the text she had written. About the girl who screamed without sound. And now, there, she was the one screaming out loud. The testimony was painful. Reliving each detail hurt as if it were the first time. But Clara spoke. Her eyes were watery, her voice firm. She spoke about the room, the trip, her cousin's gaze, the silence afterwards. She spoke as if she were bleeding, but also as if she were fighting. As she left, her mother hugged her. "You were a giant," she said. Clara didn't feel strong. She felt exhausted. But she knew something had changed. The silence was now recorded. Official. A giant step for someone who had spent years blaming herself for everything. The process would be long. The investigation, even longer. But Clara was determined. She didn't want revenge. She wanted justice. She wanted to stop her cousin from hurting anyone else. And that alone gave her the strength to carry on, even with her heart in pieces. The school was also notified. The administration acted delicately and carefully. Her cousin would be removed. Clara breathed a sigh of relief, but also scared. It was real. Now the world would know. Now she was no longer just a secret victim. She was a survivor out loud. The therapist guided her through each step. Through the ups and downs that would come. Courage doesn't eliminate fear, Clara. It just makes you carry on despite it. These words stuck in her mind. And every day, she repeated them like a silent mantra. Clara started writing again. More than before. She wrote so she wouldn't go crazy, so she wouldn't forget herself. And with each text, she left marks that reminded her, I survived. I continue. I am more than what they tried to do to me. That night, before going to sleep, Clara looked at the old letter. Now, it was just the beginning. The starting point. Because the real letter was now being written with each step she took. And the world was finally starting to listen. After her testimony, Clara felt as if she had left part of herself at that police station. It was strange walking through the school, the streets, her room, everything seemed the same, but she was no longer the same. The silent girl was giving way to someone who was beginning to understand her own worth. At school, some people started to talk. Whispers in the hallways, glances that lasted a few seconds longer. She hadn't said anything officially, but stories always find their way to spread. And yet, Clara stood her ground. Because now, she knew why she was doing all that. One rainy afternoon, she received an anonymous note in her literature notebook. I went through this too. Thank you for having courage. Clara read those words more than 10 times. And she cried. For someone else's pain. And for realizing that, without knowing it, she was already being a voice for others. That was the day that something inside her was ignited. Her courage wasn't just hers. It was also a seed. And even without wanting to, it was sprouting in other lives. She understood then that her story would not end when justice arrived. It was just beginning. The writing teacher noticed the change. Your texts are stronger, she once commented. Clara smiled slightly. It wasn't force. It was truth. And the truth, when written with soul, always rings louder than any scream. In therapy, she continued to delve into herself. She discovered forgotten memories, stifled feelings, pains that had no name. Sometimes she left the session exhausted. But other times, she left feeling light, as if she were tearing away a veil that had covered her eyes for years. Clara's mother was also in therapy. She wanted to understand how she hadn't seen, how she hadn't noticed. Their relationship, previously full of silence, now gained new words, new embraces. It wasn't perfect. But it was sincere. And that was enough. One day, Clara received an unexpected invitation. The school coordinator heard about her story through the teacher and asked if she would be willing to write something for the abuse prevention campaign they would be holding the following week. An anonymous text. No obligation. Only if she wanted to. Clara hesitated. She didn't want to expose herself any more than she already was. But she thought about the other silent voices. And she accepted. She spent the night writing. Each word was a stitched-up wound, a scar exposed with courage. When she finished, she read it out loud to herself. And for the first time, she didn't tremble. The text was read during the campaign by the coordinator herself. No one knew it was from Clara. But as the words echoed through the auditorium, she watched the faces. Many were crying. Some lowered their heads. Others just listened in silence, with respect. After that reading, more notes arrived. More looks of empathy. A first-grade girl came to her during recess and, in a low voice, said, "You saved my life and you don't even know it." Clara didn't answer. She just hugged her. Because sometimes, silence also consoles. She went back to sleep better. Not every night, but some. The nightmare still appeared, sometimes strongly, sometimes only as a shadow. But now she knew how to wake up. She knew she was no longer trapped. She knew she could ask for help. The case against her cousin continued. Slowly, as almost all cases are. But the evidence, the testimony, the assistance from the school and the therapist were paving the way for a solid path. Clara did not expect miracles from the justice system. But she expected to be heard. And, above all, to be respected. She continued writing. She kept everything in a notebook with a blue cover. One day, she thought, what if this becomes a book? She did not know how or when. But the idea of transforming pain into pages that could save lives began to gain strength within her. That night, when she closed the notebook, Clara felt something she had not felt in a long time: pride. Pride in not having kept quiet. Pride in having survived. Because now she knew, her story was no longer a secret. It was a beacon. Clara was beginning to feel the ground beneath her feet again. Her routine was returning, even if in fragments. But there were days when everything was heavy. Days when the tiredness of her soul spoke louder, and her body seemed to have no energy to even get out of bed. At those times, the past seemed to scream again. It was one of those mornings that she thought about giving up on everything. Not on justice. But on life. She felt weak, dirty, too broken. She thought that no one would ever love her with all those scars. That she would never be whole again. And for a moment, the darkness seemed comfortable. But Clara was no longer alone. She remembered the therapist, her mother, the girl she hugged in the school hallway. She remembered the notes, the texts, the campaign. She remembered that now her voice was an anchor for others. And that if she were to shut up for good, others could drown with her. She took a deep breath. She cried shamelessly. She wrote on a piece of paper, "I'm not okay." And she gave it to her mother before locking herself in her room. It was a silent but sincere cry for help. And it was answered. No judgment. No demands. Just care. In therapy, she talked about wanting to disappear. About the fear that returned without warning. The therapist was not scared. She said that this was part of the path. That the mind sometimes tries to escape pain with extreme ideas. But asking for help was already an act of enormous courage. At school, the coordinator offered to let her spend some time at home, if she needed it. But Clara refused. She wanted to continue. She needed to continue. Not as an obligation, but as resistance. Each day lived was proof that she could do more than she imagined. At home, she started to stick phrases in visible places. On the mirror, "You are valuable." On the door, "You are not guilty." On her backpack, "You are strong." It was as if she created an army of words to protect her on bad days. Words that she herself wrote, and that now served as a shield. The legal process began to move forward. Her cousin tried to deny it, tried to distort it, as so many do. But the reports, the texts, the exams, everything began to form a clear picture. The truth didn't need to be shouted. She just needed time and courage to stay. Clara followed everything from afar. Her mother took care of the legal details. But she read every document. She wanted to understand, she wanted to know. Because she was no longer just a wounded girl. She was also someone who demanded reparation. On a silent night, Clara returned to the girl's note that said, "You saved my life." And she wrote a new text. This time, not for school, but for herself. "Today I wanted to give up, but I didn't. Because now I know, pain is not my destiny. It's just a part of my path." She published this text on a social network. For the first time, she signed it with her own name. It was like coming out of the shadows. At first, she was scared. But the response was surprising. Supportive comments, messages from other girls, people saying they felt less alone because of her. At that moment, Clara understood something bigger. The healing was not just hers. It was collective. It was woven between voices that had previously been alone. Each time she told her story, it was as if she was lifting another stone off her shoulders. And helping someone else to lift theirs too. Little by little, her self-esteem also began to awaken. It wasn't about appearance, but about identity. She began to enjoy looking at herself in the mirror. Seeing herself not as a victim, but as a survivor. The warrior. The young woman who had everything she needed to keep quiet, but chose to turn her pain into words. She began to dream about the book again. Maybe one day, who knows, she could publish it. She would write without filters, without shame. Because the shame was not hers. It never was. And she made sure to make that clear in every paragraph she wrote. That night, before going to sleep, Clara read her own words and smiled. Not out of vanity, but out of gratitude. Because in that text, she recognized herself as alive. And, for the first time in a long time, she wanted to wake up the next day. The day of the hearing arrived like a bolt of lightning that Clara had already known would come, but even so, it hurt. It was as if all the progress she had been making was shaking. She woke up early, her heart racing, her hands cold. Time seemed to slow down, as if the universe was waiting with her. She put on simple clothes, but they made her feel safe. She tied her hair up like she did when she wanted to protect herself. And before leaving, she stood in front of the mirror for several minutes. She looked at herself and murmured, "You've made it this far. You're stronger than you think." Her mother drove in the car in silence. It wasn't a heavy silence, but a complicit one. They both knew that that day would mark another cut on her skin, but also another healed scar. The courthouse wasn't just a building. It was the place where Clara would face to face, the name she had avoided for so long, her attacker. When she entered the courthouse, the different smell, the security guards, the cold air conditioning, everything seemed out of her world. But she kept going. She sat in the waiting room with her hands clasped tightly on her knees. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. But inside, it was as if she were at war. The courtroom was smaller than she had imagined. Clara sat with her lawyer next to her. The judge entered. And then he entered too. Her cousin. The man who had destroyed her childhood. He looked at her, as if he still thought he would intimidate her. But Clara held his gaze. Not angrily. Firmly. She didn't need to speak at that moment. It was just to listen, for the sides to be presented, the lawyers to be heard. But even so, just being there required more courage than anyone could understand. Just being there was already a victory. Outside, when it was all over, she walked out on shaky legs. But there was something different. A strange relief, as if she had finally faced the monster that inhabited her nightmares. And he wasn't as big as he seemed. He was just a man. Small. Cruel. But small. Clara went home and slept for hours. A deep sleep, like someone who has unloaded tons of things from their chest. When she woke up, she felt empty for a few moments, but then she realized, it was space. Space that had previously been occupied by pain, now free for healing. She wrote about the hearing in the notebook with the blue cover. She described everything in detail, but not as a victim. As a witness to her own strength. She titled it, "The Day I Looked at the Past and It Didn't Make Me Lower My Eyes." A few days later, she received a message from her lawyer. The case was going strong. Her testimony, the archived texts, the support from her therapist, everything was documented. And for the first time, Clara believed, justice could indeed happen. Even if it was slow, even if it was imperfect. The writing teacher read a new text by Clara and couldn't hold back her tears. "You need to publish this, Clara. The world needs to hear it." She smiled shyly, but felt something new, confidence. Maybe she really could write a book. And not just for herself. But for all the ones they never managed to tell. The mother, now more present than ever, began to read the texts too. She cried, hugged, asked for forgiveness, not out of guilt, but out of pain for not having seen. And Clara understood. Because now, they were both on the same side of the fight. Mother and daughter, rebuilding together. At school, Clara still received stares, but now she didn't hide. She began to walk with her head held high. Even though there were difficult days inside, she learned that being strong didn't mean not suffering, it was about moving on anyway. That night, before going to sleep, Clara looked at herself in the mirror again. She touched her face tenderly. And whispered, "You survived. You won today. And tomorrow, you will continue to win." Because now she knew, she was no longer the girl who kept quiet. She was the woman who learned to speak out. Clara never wanted to be recognized for her pain. But, little by little, she realized that her courage was becoming something greater than she imagined. A teacher at school discreetly called her into the teacher's lounge. They were organizing a week to raise awareness about abuse and wanted her to participate. Not to tell everything, but to give voice to what many still kept quiet. She hesitated. Her heart sank, her breath caught. Was she ready to expose herself like this? But later, at home, she reread everything she had written in the last few months. And she realized that, in a way, she had already been exposing herself. Each text, each published word, was a fragment of her shouting to the world, "Don't be silent." She decided to accept. On one condition, she didn't want applause. She wanted to make an impact. She wanted to touch hearts, provoke reflections, save lives. It wasn't about vanity. It was about survival. And at that moment, she understood, when pain is transformed into purpose, it loses its power to destroy us. On the morning of the presentation, Clara barely slept. She prepared a direct, firm text, without embellishments. Her hands trembled as she held the microphone. But when she looked at the full auditorium, she saw attentive faces, some scared, others emotional. And she took a deep breath. "I am Clara. And for a long time I thought my story was a reason to be ashamed. Today, I know that it is strength." The first sentence was enough to silence the entire room. She didn't give any details. She didn't need to. She spoke about fear, about silence, about the weight of carrying a pain that cannot be seen. With each paragraph, the tension in the room increased. Not because of sadness, but because of the truth. Clara wasn't just talking about herself. She was talking for hundreds. For thousands. For those who never had a chance to speak. And at that moment, her voice wasn't just hers. It was everyone's. When it was over, there was a deep silence. No clapping. No whispering. Just teary eyes and broken hearts. Until, discreetly, a first-grade girl stood up and hugged her. A long, trembling hug. And Clara understood, another life was being touched. In the following days, the school received 5 reports of abuse. 5 girls found the courage to tell their stories. The coordinator, moved, said to Clara, "You saved lives without even realizing it." And that resonated deeply within her. Because now she knew, her role went far beyond her own pain. But along with the strength came the judgments. Some people began to whisper in the hallways. Some said she wanted attention. Others thought it was all an exaggeration. And Clara felt the weight of living a truth that bothered those who preferred to pretend it didn't exist. She went back to therapy and cried. She cried for the injustice, for the evil, for the ignorance. But she also cried with relief. Because she learned that even the criticism proved that she was touching real wounds. And this, as painful as it was necessary. The mother, stronger than ever, became a shield. She protected Clara from what she could, but she also taught her that not everything can be controlled. You are growing up, daughter. And growing up, sometimes, hurts more than the wound itself. Clara listened, understood, and kept every word. One night, she received a message from an adult woman. "I read your text. I have never told anyone. I am 42 years old. Today, for the first time, I spoke about my abuse. Thank you for being the courage I did not have." Clara read the message 10 times. And cried again. This time, out of gratitude. She realized that her story spanned generations. That what she had experienced was not unique, but that her choice to speak out was rare. And that made her special. Not because she was a victim, but because she was a voice. She wrote more. She shared more. And each text was like a light bulb lit in some dark corner of the world. Some were grateful. Others were silent. But she knew, she could no longer stop. That night, Clara looked out the window at the sky. The stars seemed closer. And for the first time, she felt proud not only of having survived, but of having transformed her pain into a bridge. Because now, she was not only talking, she was guiding. The days that followed Clara's presentation were intense. In every corner of the school, stories that had previously been stifled emerged. Some girls asked the principal for help. Others sought her out directly. The silent third-grade girl, who never spoke to anyone, wrote a note and left it in Clara's backpack. In it, there were only 3 words, "You saved me." Clara read the note with trembling hands. She didn't know the author's face, but she felt her pain as if it were her own. And for the first time, she understood that her story was creating an invisible network of resistance. Girls who had never looked each other in the eye now recognized each other through common wounds. The school administration suggested creating a support group. And Clara, despite being afraid, agreed to coordinate it. not as a counselor, but as a presence. She would be there to listen, to welcome, to share. The first meeting was in an empty room, with chairs in a circle. 4 girls showed up. At the second meeting, there were 12. No one was forced to speak. They could only listen, cry, write. Clara brought her notebooks. She read carefully chosen passages, respecting each girl's time. In a short time, the group became a shelter. It didn't solve everything, but it showed that no one needed to carry the weight alone. One afternoon, one of the girls, Anna, told Clara something that made her shudder. Anna's abuser was her stepfather. And he still lived in the same house. She spoke with a choked voice, her eyes downcast. Clara stood up, approached and held her hand. It was with that gesture that Anna broke down. The school, in response to the report, followed protocols. Anna's mother was called. The Child Protection Council was notified. And Clara watched everything from afar, her heart in pieces, but with the certainty that she was seeing a new story begin to change, right before her eyes. That night, Clara wrote about Anna. She didn't mention names. But she described the courage of a girl who, even living with fear at her bedside, decided not to keep quiet. It was a reflection of her own journey. It was as if, in some way, she was helping herself every time she reached out to another. Over time, news of the group spread to other schools. A teacher from another city got in touch. She wanted to implement something similar. She asked if she could use Clara's texts as a basis. She authorized it, with a lump in her throat. It was all so much bigger than she imagined. In therapy, Clara talked about it. The psychologist smiled tenderly. "You are planting healing where before there was only pain, Clara. And that is rare." She took a deep breath. She still didn't know how to deal with compliments. But inside her, a part of her was warming up. Despite the progress, there were gray days. Days when Clara would wake up with the feeling of being back in the past. Smells, sounds, a news story in the newspaper, anything could trigger memories. At those times, she allowed herself to stop. Breathe. Go back to her notebook. And it was on one of those days that she wrote perhaps the most powerful text of all: "I am not what they did to me. I am what I chose to build with what was left." She posted it in the group. And that same day, she received dozens of messages. One of them was from a mother who discovered that her daughter had also suffered abuse and, thanks to the text, had the courage to talk to her. Clara realized, with each new step, that her pain was not an end. It was a seed. It was a bridge. And although there were parts of her that still hurt, others were beginning to blossom with a strength she never imagined she had. One of her teachers suggested that she send her texts to a publisher. He said that there was too much truth there to keep hidden. Clara laughed, embarrassed, but wrote down the idea. Because, deep down, she knew, what had started as a rant was now a tool. That night, before going to sleep, Clara received a call. It was Anna. Her mother had believed her. Her stepfather had been removed. And, on the other end of the line, a fragile but relieved voice said, "Thank you for listening to me. You were the first person who didn't make me feel guilty." Clara closed her eyes. She cried silently. And smiled. Because there, another voice had been freed. As the months went by, Clara became known not only within the school, but also outside it. Teachers commented on her strength, parents cited her as an example of overcoming difficulties, and teenagers from other cities sent messages asking for help, venting, seeking refuge in her words. She hadn't planned it. She never dreamed of being a role model for anything. But now she was there, facing a movement that was born from pain and grew with courage. And with that, a new kind of weight also came, that of being a beacon for so many others in the midst of darkness. Clara began to feel something she couldn't name. A constant internal pressure. She thought she needed to always be strong, always available, always with the right word. After all, how many people were looking up to her? How many expected something from her every day? One morning, she woke up and didn't want to get out of bed. She felt exhausted, as if every piece of her had been ripped away little by little. She cried without knowing exactly why. And at that moment, she understood, she was forgetting to take care of herself. She was so busy saving others that she had left her own soul silently crying for help. She went back to therapy more often. She confessed her tiredness, her fear of disappointing, her guilt for feeling weak at times. The psychologist listened carefully and said something that Clara would never forget: lighthouses also burn inside. You don't have to be light all the time. The phrase echoed for days. And then Clara decided to take a break. Not to give up, but to take a breather. She told the support group. She explained it sincerely. She asked for time to recharge. And, to her surprise, everyone understood. Some even thanked her for the example of self-care. During this time, Clara went back to writing just for herself. Without any intention of posting, without thinking about making an impact. Just herself and the paper. And there, she rediscovered her essence. She reread her old texts and realized how much she had grown. Not only as a survivor, but as a woman, as a human being. She began to explore other forms of expression. She painted, recorded audios, created songs quietly, without showing them to anyone. And, in the silence of these new discoveries, she healed parts that were still bleeding hidden. It was during this interval that something unexpected happened. A publisher responded to an email that had been sent by a professor, without Clara knowing. The publisher said he was deeply touched by the texts. He wanted to publish them in a book. A real book. With a cover, pages, a title. Her story taking over the world. Clara was speechless. For a moment, she wanted to refuse. She was afraid of exposing herself even more. But something inside her whispered, "You are already a voice, Clara. Now let your story fly." And with trembling but firm hands, she said yes. Choosing the title came easily. The silence that became a voice. It was the name of the first text, the name of her beginning. It was more than a title, it was the synthesis of everything she had experienced up until that point. When she told her mother, she was hugged tightly. "Do you realize what you are doing, daughter?" Clara shook her head, moved. Because, in truth, she didn't yet. But she felt it. And that was enough. In the book's dedication, she wrote, "To all the voices that still whisper in the dark, you are not alone. I have heard. I have listened. And now, the world will hear too." And at that moment, Clara understood something profound. Her story was not about being an example. It was about being true. About existing with all her scars, fears and strengths. And that was enough to continue changing the world. The book launch was simple, but full of meaning. The school lent its auditorium, the community mobilized, and people from different places came just to hear Clara. She went up on stage with tears in her eyes. That was not a day of celebration. It was a day of remembrance. Of courage. Of truth. She looked at the audience and saw faces she recognized, schoolmates, teachers, some mothers who had written to her in secret, and even Anna, sitting in the front row, with a shy but whole smile. It was more than an audience. It was a living network of stories that found each other through pain. Clara took a deep breath. She grabbed the microphone with sweaty hands. She didn't read a speech. She didn't memorize beautiful words. She just spoke. She told how it all started. She said she wasn't strong every day. That she still cried in silence sometimes. But that she learned that it wasn't the pain that defined who she was, but what it did to her. With each sentence, her eyes filled with tears. Because Clara didn't speak as someone who won, but as someone who keeps fighting. And that made all the difference. It was there, in that vulnerability exposed with courage, that the audience saw themselves reflected. At the end of her speech, she read an excerpt from the book. It was the same text she had written in writing class, months ago. Now, it wasn't just a loose page in a notebook. It was a symbol of rebirth. And when she finished reading, silence filled the space. A heavy, respectful, transformative silence. And then came the applause. Long-standing. After the event, lines formed to hug her. Some people didn't say anything, they just cried. Others gave her letters, notes, drawings. A man with gray hair held her hand firmly and said, "My granddaughter went through what you went through. She is here today because of you." Clara took all that home as if she were carrying the world in her hands. And perhaps she was. But, unlike in the past, now she was not carrying it alone. For the first time, she felt that her pain had found an echo, space, and purpose. In the following days, her story began to circulate in local newspapers, blogs, and even on a regional TV program. Interviews were scheduled. Invitations came. They wanted to hear the girl who transformed silence into a bridge for other voices. But she knew, she needed to keep her feet on the ground. She decided to choose carefully where she would speak. She did not want fame. She wanted the truth. And wherever there was sincere listening, there she would be. But wherever there was exploitation, sensationalism, or haste, she would retreat. Because her story was sacred. Not a product. One night, while rereading the first texts, Clara came across a detail that she had not noticed before. In almost all of them, there was a recurring word, hope. She did not know when she had started using it. But there it was, hidden between lines of pain, as if the writing itself had been trying to warn her, from the beginning, that better days would come. She smiled to herself, sitting on the bed, hugging the notebook. The girl who had once been afraid to tell anyone, was now the author of her own freedom. And more than that, she was an instrument for others to build theirs. But there was still one step she had not taken. A step that weighed more than all the others. Talking to him. Facing the past not only in writing, but in front of the aggressor himself. Not for revenge. Not for anger. But for liberation. The decision came like a breath of fresh air. She no longer wanted to live with that shadow hanging over her back. She needed to tell him, in no uncertain terms, that he had not won. That the pain he had caused had blossomed into something he would never understand: empathy, compassion, light. She knew that this moment was coming. But she was in no hurry. She was preparing herself, day after day, to look the past in the eye, and move forward with her head held high. The day dawned gray. There was no rain, but the sky seemed to share the same tension that Clara carried in her chest. She knew that this would be a different day. A turning point. Finally, she would have before her the one who had once stolen her peace. Her uncle. The man who, for so long, had been a shadow and a wound. She had been called to testify in a case that had been running silently, thanks to the anonymous complaint filed months ago. Now the courts wanted to hear her version. Not as a rumor, not as a hearsay, but as the official truth. Clara hesitated. She thought about refusing. But deep down she knew, it was time. Arriving at the forum, her hands were shaking. The place smelled of paper, coffee, and old tension. It was cold, soulless. But Clara was warm inside. Burning with courage, even if it was hidden under layers of fear. She sat in the reserved room, waiting to be called. Outside, he was also waiting. Years had passed. She didn't know how he was, if he remembered her, if he felt guilty. But none of that mattered. It wasn't about him. It was about her. About no longer carrying alone what had never been hers. When the door opened and they called him, Clara stood up slowly. She walked to the chair, looked straight ahead, and breathed. She wouldn't need to look at him. She wouldn't need to look at his face to prove anything. The truth was inside her. Intact. And ready to be told. With a firm voice, Clara told him. For the first time, with all the details. The room was completely silent. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. Because the tears she needed had already been cried. There, she simply delivered the truth, raw, clean, painful, but without rancor. The lawyer tried to interrupt. The judge asked for silence. Clara continued. She spoke of sleepless nights, of fear, of shame, of guilt that was not hers. But she also spoke of writing, of reconstruction, of the book, of the girls she had helped, of the strength she had found after the pain. When she finished, she lowered her eyes for a moment. And only then did she realize that she was surrounded by women. Secretary, judge, psychologist, assistant. All women. And all with teary eyes. It was not just a statement. It was an act of collective healing. When she left the room, Clara did not look back. The past no longer weighed her down. It now walked beside her, recognized, named, disarmed. And that was liberating. Outside, her mother was waiting for her, sitting, with a distressed look. When she saw her, Clara just nodded. She said nothing. But that small gesture was enough. Her mother understood. They hugged for long minutes. No words were spoken. And none were necessary. That night, Clara slept deeply. Like she hadn't in years. For the first time, without nightmares, without shocks. She woke up in the middle of the night, just to look around. The peace was real. And it was inside her. In the following days, she didn't tell anyone what had happened. She didn't post, she didn't write, she didn't report it. It was hers. And some victories don't need to be announced. They just need to be felt. But there was something she knew, deep down, she was now ready for whatever was to come. Because if she had the strength to face her own hell head-on, she would also have the strength to continue building bridges to others. And in that nighttime silence, Clara whispered to herself, for the first time out loud, "I won." The days that followed the testimony were strangely silent. Not the silence of before, full of pain and fear, but a new silence. A silence of peace, of breathing, of space. It was as if, for the first time, Clara could inhabit her own body without feeling that it belonged to someone else. The lightness did not come with a party. It came with subtlety. A weightless awakening, a looser breathing, a less burdensome look in the mirror. She still remembered everything, but now the memory did not paralyze her. It was like a scar, present, visible, but without pain when touched. Clara began to walk more. Alone. Without headphones, without distractions. Just her and the noise of the world. And on those walks, she thought. She thought about everything she had experienced, everything she had told, and especially about everything she could still do with it. It was on one of those walks that she passed in front of her grandmother's old house. She stopped. There, where it all began, there was now another family. Children ran around the yard. It was strange to see life where there had been silence and pain before. But it was also beautiful. Time had its own ways of healing. She didn't cry. She just watched for a few minutes, like someone watching a movie and already knows the ending. Then she turned her back and kept walking. The road ahead was long, but now Clara was no longer afraid of it. Her mother noticed the change. She didn't ask questions, but she paid attention to the details. She made coffee for longer, and waited for Clara at the school door even when she didn't need to. It was her way of saying, "I see you. And I'm here." And that was enough. Clara's book continued to circulate. Students from other schools began writing letters. Some said they had never told anyone about their abuse, but that reading the book had given them the strength to start. Clara read each letter with an open heart, as if each one were an extension of her own. She realized that her mission was not to save anyone. That was something each person did for themselves. But she could open paths, turn on lights, hold hands in the dark. And that, yes, was powerful. More than any fame, more than any award. She began to plan meetings with young people in public schools. Nothing formal. Just conversation circles, reading passages, listening. She brought paper and pen, and encouraged them to write. As she had done. Writing, Clara said, was like speaking to the world when the world is not yet ready to listen. Each meeting was a new mirror. Girls and boys with shy looks, stories between the lines. Clara listened to everything. She never interrupted. She never judged. She was just there. Whole, present, welcoming. It was there that she felt that her pain had finally become a bridge. Once, a girl of only 12 hugged her at the end of a circle and whispered in her ear, "I thought I was going to die with this inside me. But now I know I can live." Clara held back her tears all the way home. And that night, she wrote in her notebook, "It's worth it. Even with all the pain. It's worth it." She still had relapses. Moments of fear, of memories that came without asking permission. But now, she knew what to do. She took a deep breath. She picked up her notebook. She wrote. And she remembered, the girl who had once been silenced was now teaching others to scream with their hearts. It was as if, inside her, there now lived a woman and a child. The child was still scared. The woman was strong enough to protect her. And together, they kept walking. Clara's story had no end point. Because stories like hers don't end, they change. And with each step she took others with her. Not as a burden, but as strength. And even when no one saw it, even when she was alone, Clara knew, she had overcome the worst. And because of that, nothing could stop her anymore. Time passed, and with it came a maturity that Clara didn't even know was possible to achieve. There was no more fear in her steps. There was firmness. A serene firmness, achieved at the cost of much broken silence. The pain still existed, but now it was memory. Not a prison. Her project in schools spread. From city to city, other institutions began to call her. Not as a celebrity, but as a survivor. As someone who had crossed the abyss and returned to tell the story. Clara wasn't looking for an audience. She was looking for connection. And she found it. In every young face that listened to her there was a mirror. Every prolonged silence, every held-back tear, every trembling hand holding the paper, everything was familiar to her. It was like revisiting her past from 1,000 different angles. And in each one, Clara left a little of herself. She began to receive invitations to larger events. Seminars. Congresses. Interviews. She refused most of them. She didn't want her pain to become a spectacle. But every now and then, she accepted. When she felt that she could make a difference. When she knew that, even in a crowded place, her voice would reach those who really needed it. It was on one of these occasions that a young woman approached her after her speech, with tears in her eyes. She was holding a notebook. She said that she had written her own story for the first time, inspired by Clara. "I kept this for 10 years, she whispered. Clara held that notebook as if it were sacred. That day, she realized, her story was no longer just hers. It had multiplied. It had echoed. It had gained a voice in other mouths, in other roles, in other lives. And that was more than redemption. It was revolution. Clara still lived with her mother. They had built a new, more mature, truer bond. They talked openly about everything now. Including the past. It was difficult, yes. But liberating. Her mother, even though she was full of guilt for not having seen her before, was now a constant support. A silent fortress. Over time, Clara felt it was time to go back to school. Not out of obligation. But by choice. She wanted to study psychology. She wanted to understand the wounds of the world, the ones that scream and the ones that whisper. She wanted to be prepared to help, not only with her experience, but with her knowledge. At college, she made friends. Few, but true friends. She didn't tell her story right away. She learned that not everyone needs to know everything. But when she felt confident, she opened the door. And, almost always, she discovered that there were also hidden scars on the other side. She began to dream of a shelter. A space where victims of abuse could be heard, guided, embraced. Without bureaucracy. Without judgment. A place where, "I believe in you," came before any question. This dream began to take shape. She made contacts, sought support, gathered volunteers. She used part of the money she earned from her book to start the project. It wouldn't be big, but it would be real. It would be safe. A place where no Clara would have to carry alone what she didn't ask for to live. The nights were now filled with plans, notes, plans, ideas. Clara rediscovered herself. No longer as a victim, but as a bridge. As a beacon. As a whole woman, who rebuilt herself piece by piece and now reached out to others. Sometimes, she would sit on the porch with her old notebook. The one from the editorial office. She would read it again. She would feel everything again. But now, without despair. Only with respect for the girl who had the courage to start, even when she didn't know where it would lead her. And there, under the night sky, Clara understood, her story would not end there. Because as long as there was a girl in silence, she would continue to speak. She would continue to fight. She would continue to be a voice. The shelter was opened on a clear morning. Clara arrived early, before everyone else. She walked through the still silent hallways, touching the walls as if she could feel the heart beating there. It was small, simple, but whole. And, above all, real. A place where voices would no longer be silenced. At the entrance, a discreet sign read, "You are not alone." That phrase was everything. It was what Clara would have needed to hear at 15 years old. It was what she now said to every person who walked through that door, even without speaking. It was shelter in the form of truth. The first person to be helped was a 14-year-old girl. She arrived accompanied by her grandmother, with her eyes downcast and her body hunched over. Clara received her calmly, respectfully, without rushing. She didn't ask anything. She simply offered her presence. Sometimes, the first step is to be seen. When the girl began to speak, Clara felt the past come alive. But this time, she was the safe haven. The woman who listens, understands, believes. There, Clara saw the cycle break. A new story was beginning. A story that would not need to be carried alone for so long. The following days were intense. Painful stories arrived, one after the other. But Clara did not let herself be consumed. She had learned to take care of herself before taking care of others. And that was what she taught the girls who came to her. No one needs to be strong all the time to be whole. What was once a wound was now a bridge. What was once silence was now an echo. What was once a fall was now a foundation. Clara had rebuilt herself not to erase what she had experienced, but to ensure that it would not be in vain. At night, at home, she wrote. She still maintained the habit. But now her notebooks were filled with more plans than pain. She dreamed of more downtown units. Of partnerships. Of a bill that would bring the issue into schools. She wanted the cry of so many muffled voices to become a national issue. Once, at an event, she was called to the stage as an example of overcoming. But Clara refused the title. She didn't see herself as an example. She saw herself as a process. Because overcoming is not forgetting. It's continuing to remember. It's transforming pain without having to deny it. At the same event, a mother came to her crying. She said that her daughter had tried to take her own life before she heard Clara's story. She said that now she wrote every day and wanted to study psychology. Clara hugged her tightly. And in that hug, she understood, her purpose had found an echo. She didn't save anyone. But she turned on lights. She showed paths. She offered what she never had, listening, welcoming, hope. And that was all. Because the world doesn't need heroes. It needs people willing to stay. To listen. Saying, "I believe in you." One afternoon, Clara returned to the school where it all began. She entered the old classroom. She sat in the same chair where she wrote her first essay. She took a deep breath. She closed her eyes. And she gave thanks. For the pain, for the courage, for the journey. For having survived. And for having chosen to truly live. She looked at the blackboard. She imagined the girl she had been, sitting there, with eyes full of fear. And she said in a low voice, as if speaking to herself, "You did it." As she was leaving, the principal asked her to leave a message for the students on the school wall. Clara wrote, "Never underestimate the strength of those who remain standing after a fall. Each scar is proof that you have won." When she returned home, she received a call. It was from a young woman who had seen her story in a video. She wanted help. She wanted to talk. Clara smiled. She wrote down her name, scheduled a time, and thanked her for another chance to make a difference. That night, before going to sleep, Clara opened her internet channel. She saw comments, messages, requests for help, and also thanks. She read each one with the same respect with which she listened to the voices in the center. Because each message was a world that opened up. Before closing her laptop, she recorded a short video. With a firm voice and shining eyes, she said, "If you have come this far, know this, your pain matters. Your story matters. And you are not alone. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Let's make this chain of love reach more lives." Then she turned off the light. And slept peacefully. Like she hadn't done in a long time. Because, in the end, Clara understood, it wasn't about forgetting what she had experienced. It was about transforming what she had experienced into light for the path of others. And so, her story became a seed. And it blossomed.